Well, welcome everyone who is joining us tonight, and good evening to our group. We are the Genealogical Research Society of New Orleans, and a welcome to all of the members who are here with us tonight. And also we are welcome everyone who is joining us on Facebook Live. This is our second Facebook Live broadcast. And we'll have a video recording of this on our Facebook page after the program is over. So we really appreciate the chance to be with you again tonight. My name is Stephen Stewart. I'm the president of the Genealogical Research Society of New Orleans. And we were established in 1960 to foster an interest in family research and to encourage the preservation of genealogical records in New Orleans and in Louisiana and the Gulf South. GRSNO is a membership organization. If you have an interest in genealogical research, please consider joining our organization. You can learn more about membership and access the application form on our website, GRSNO.org. We share research and records through our journal, New Orleans Genesis, and members can access an archive of Genesis articles and records going back 60 years. This is a great resource for genealogical researchers, seeking unique records and hard to find documents. GRSNO also hosts educational meetings in the spring and fall of each year. Tonight's discussion kicks off our Fall 2022 series. We are happy to have with us tonight Dr. Joan DeJean. Dr. DeJean is trustee professor of Romance languages at the University of Pennsylvania. Before then, she taught at Princeton and Yale. She grew up in Southwest Louisiana in a French-speaking family and was educated at Newcomb College, Tulane, and then at Yale. She has written extensively about France and the French and about the city of Paris. She has written 12 books on 17th and 18th century France. These included How Paris Became Paris, The Age of Comfort, and The Essence of Style. Her latest book, which is the subject of our discussion tonight, is Mutinous Women, How the French Convicts Became Founding Mothers of the Gulf Coast. This book, which I have a copy of here, is a fascinating story. It's the tale of a long-forgotten group of ordinary French women who were unjustly accused and convicted of crimes, imprisoned, and then deported in 1719 to the Louisiana colony. Those who survived the arduous months-long journey eventually settled, married, and raised families. Their descendants are in thousands of family trees in Louisiana, the Mississippi, Alabama Gulf Coast, and beyond. So the story of the Mutinous Women is a topic of significant interest to our members, and I hope those of you watching tonight. Our discussion tonight with Dr. DeJean who is joining us from Philadelphia, will be a virtual book club format. Dr. DeJean and I will spend the first half of the program discussing the book and the research resources. Then she will discuss the questions that GRSNO members have submitted in advance. Dr. DeJean, welcome and thank you for joining us tonight.
Thank you for having me. It's nice to be with you in a way. It's cold in Philadelphia, so it's a very different experience from what you're having down there.
That's great. Well, we're glad to have you. And we wanted to start the program tonight by talking a little bit about the context for the story of these women. And I think that would be an interesting way to help our audience to understand what life was like at that time, to get an understanding of what they went through. So to start off, I wanted to ask, what was Paris like at the time that these women were deported?
Okay, it's a great question. This is the year when which most of them were arrested, deportations took place, etc. 1719 was an extraordinary year in Paris history, in world history, in financial history. In 1719, France has the biggest economy in Europe, and it was turned over completely to one man, a Scottish economic theorist, and he was allowed to do what he wanted to put all his theories into place in Paris. The essence of it all was a stock market. He created stock had never been publicly traded in Paris. John Law created a stock market. He created stock, and that stock boomed. He created the world's first stock market boom. And that stock market boom was based on stock in the French Indies Company, and that was founded on Louisiana. In May 1719, the first shares were offered for sale at 500 French pounds. By November 1719, a share of stock bought at 500 was worth 9,375 pounds. Now you think of that kind of gain. The city went crazy for this. And it was during that period that the majority of the women who ended up in Louisiana were arrested, charged, imprisoned, deported. It all happened very quickly and just in that window of opportunity while the stocks were being successful. John Law based all of this on lies. He told everyone that Louisiana would be full of gold mines and that tobacco would be growing in Louisiana. It would be wonderful. Now, tobacco was a huge crop for the English along the eastern seaboard, and that tobacco sold for a fortune in Europe, including in France. He guaranteed that Louisiana tobacco would be much better and would sell for much more. Tobacco had never been grown in Louisiana. It was never grown successfully, but nobody knew. They believed him, and the stocks were based on these lies. At that moment, John Law could do anything he wanted. And at one point, and that's in the spring, just about the time the stock was first offered, he decided he wanted women for Louisiana. So he was able to, I love the cat walking around, by the way, sorry, hi. So he was able to arrest women. He enlisted the help of a number of police officers in Paris, all of whom were corrupt. All of them were subsequently put on trial and convicted of corruption. They helped him. They were allowed to arrest. They just called the women prostitutes. It was easy. Prostitute, prostitute, prostitute. And because of that, deportation of women to Louisiana existed.
Okay. And we wanted to talk also a little bit about the numbers, in terms of women who were arrested, women who were placed in chains to be put on these ships. And so can you give us a sense of the magnitude of this and what these women, how they were actually transported?
Okay. About 400 women were arrested. Most of them were labeled prostitutes. The evidence was at best, I will say, extremely circumstantial. In many cases, there was no evidence whatsoever. The word was just used. On July 27, 1719, and by then the stock is really rising, 225 women were sentenced to lifetime exile from France, exile in perpetuity from France. In October 1719, and by this time you realize the stock is booming, nearly 200 traveled to French ports in chains. They were chained into gangs and sent to French ports. Later in 1719, approximately 134 women were loaded onto ships. I can't give exact numbers. By then, they were rushing so much that they didn't bother to keep an accurate toll. Their manifestos for the two ships on which they traveled, I think the manifest for the first ship, the two brothers, the Deux Frères, on which 39 women traveled, is probably accurate. The manifest for the ship on which the majority of the women traveled, La Mutine, the Mutinous Woman, that's a mess, is the simplest way to put it. I would guess, my best guess is that 95 or 96 women traveled, but there could be others I don't know about. Since I published the book, so a descendant of a woman contacted me. I'm pretty sure she, even her name is listed on the manifest with a mistake in her first name, which was common in all of this. And she is described as having been freed and remaining in France. I'm pretty sure that she did travel and did survive. So there are possibilities that people may have in family records information about women, and I may have files on them because they were listed as freed. I didn't continue to track them, and there's nothing you can do. So you can see it's a real mess. In the ship's holds, they were also kept in chain because they were such dangerous criminals. They'd been labeled in this way. And they were referred to by the French authorities as merchandise for Louisiana. So those are the numbers you have.
I see. And where did they settle when the survivors who made the journey? And it was a very difficult time. It was over the winter months. I think the Lummi team arrived in February of
February 27th, 1720. Can you imagine traveling the Atlantic chained in the hold of a ship that was apparently very poorly designed, leaky, humid? Nonetheless, I think either 62 or 63 women survived from the 134 who were shipped off, and they began life on the Gulf Coast. They were dumped on nobody wanted them. So several barrier islands turned them away. They finally were allowed to stay on Ship Island, which you probably know today, which was uninhabited and had no fresh water and no source of food. So they were there initially, but then by the time they finished their stay on Ship Island, the stock market had gone bust. And France was knowing what financial historians call the first financial meltdown in history. And when the meltdown took place, everybody forgot about those women. So they dumped them on the beach in Biloxi and they started traveling. And they were extraordinary. Some got as far as Illinois very quickly. Some got to Arkansas, to really the wilds of Arkansas. Some got to Natchez. They were all over the French settlements in the colony of Louisiana within months. And they started marrying and raising families and beginning lives that must have been so unimaginable. These are for the most part Parisians. They were living a few months earlier in the most populous and most modern city in Europe, and they're dumped onto places that New Orleans doesn't even exist, and they're living there.
It's an amazing story of how they, their lives in the new Louisiana colony
Right.
so much different, and how they made it through that time. And one of the things we wanted to do tonight was to go a little deeper into the story of one of the founding mothers, so that you could understand, our audience could understand the whole process, how she was wrongfully charged, her journey, and then her survival and establishment of a better life. And I was wondering if you have an example of one of the women you could talk about and
Sure.
what her story was like.
I can talk about many of them since I know there are descendants in the audience of some of these women. I'm not going to choose any of those. I thought I would choose a woman, and I thought I would narrow down a category that interests me very much. Women who survived. I know they survived. They married. I know they had descendants. And they had descendants who survived. I don't have records of the children dying. And yet no one has contacted me saying they're descendants of these women. So I'm wondering if the lines have died out or if people just don't know. So I thought I'd begin by giving several names of women in that category. The first one is Marie Avril, Avril, like April. The second, and her family was in Bayou Saint John. So, and it was an extended family. I can't believe no one's left. Marie-Madeleine Doyart, Doyart. She was Irish. She had several children and no sense of them. Marie-Françoise Lecoustelier de Jouy de Palcy, the great noblewoman in all of this, who arrived in Arkansas. I don't know if, I know she married. I don't know if she had children. I know she died in New Orleans, but she could have had children. There was no record keeping at what was called the Arkansas Post. So she might have had children. A wonderful Parisian named Angélique Reff, Reffe, who had two sets of twin daughters, which is remarkable enough. And I don't know if any of those survived. And Marianne Giard, who married a drummer in New Orleans called Drumstick Baguette. That's what everyone called him. And the children took on that name, Baguette. I don't know if there are any baguettes left around. And finally, the woman I'm going to talk about, whose name was Marianne Chartier, Chartier. And I'd love to know if she had descendants. Marianne Chartier was like a number of the women born in the provinces into a tiny village in the Beauce. The Beauce is what's known as the breadbasket of France. It's the area around Chartres, little villages, lots of wheat fields. She was a poor family, the daughter of a man who made whistles, which the police held against her. So this was some contemptible business. But she was educated, she was literate, and she became the governess for a nobleman in the area who was a widow and had children from his marriage. And she raised those children and educated them. Then the nobleman remarried. Immediately, the new wife got jealous of Marianne Chartier, and she denounced her to the police as a femme de mauvaise vie, a loose woman. The curate, the priest of the little village, agreed with her. However, and this is very unusual in a prison file to have this, the lieutenant general of the area, so the civil authority in the area, stepped in and said the priest was lying and that the priest was an idiot and they were making this all up. So at that, the second wife threw the governess out of the house. Now we know from television that governesses are often accused of things in households. She threw her out. Marianne Chartier went to Paris, and there the police arrested her. The nobleman was so enraged about this that he threw his new wife out of the house and he threw all her clothing into the street. He said to the police that Marianne Chartier had been a fine employee, that she had raised his children beautifully and given them an excellent education. Nonetheless, John Law needed women for Louisiana. She was down on that list as a prostitute. And she became passenger number 114 on that ship, the Mutinous Woman, and ended up in Louisiana. In Louisiana, she married a first time in New Orleans to a Frenchman who was a wig maker. I love that. I can't imagine many people in New Orleans were having wigs made, but that was his profession. And he died after a couple of years. She remarried And her second husband was a nobleman. So she married an actual nobleman in New Orleans who was a ship's captain. He was the captain of one of the Indies Company's ships. He was a major figure in New Orleans, and they had several children together. She died in 1731, and he remarried, and was raising her children. And I don't know if Marianne Chartier's children with the nobleman survived or not. They could be out there somewhere. So this is not, each trajectory is different. And if we have time at the end, I'm happy to talk about others, but that's one. So a young woman of poverty in the French provinces ends up married to an actual French nobleman in New Orleans and the wife of a ship's captain.
One of the things that this kind of makes a good transition to is the research journey that you embarked on in trying to understand the lives of these women. And you've become familiar with a number of records and archives in France, and we wanted to ask you about the types of records that you found. It's some, according to as you describe them in the book, some were financial, some were arrest records, prison records. Could you tell us about the what kinds of records still exist today, and those differences? You mentioned the provinces and how the women came from the provinces, and what the differences are between records in Paris and in the provinces.
Thank you. I'm happy to talk about that. Several people have written me with questions such as, would you look up a couple of things in the church archives in Paris for me? And that made me realize that people assume that things have survived. In the provinces in France, many churches have their records are preserved. They're often even online. If a woman is born in the provinces, in a morning I can find, once I found the church, and in a village that's usually easy, I can do generations of her family history. In the provinces, however, there are very few financial records because there were few notaries in tiny villages. There wasn't enough work for them. And there's almost never any kind of what the French call criminel. I translated it as vice. In other words, police records, arrest records. That you just rarely have. Paris is the polar opposite. For any woman born in Paris, Paris has no church records left. I need to tell you about the French Revolution so you can understand this. In 1789, the revolutionaries were tearing things down. Notably, you all know they tore down the Bastille prison. And the Bastille prison housed the archives of all the police files, all the arrest records, the police records, etc. The revolutionaries were very careful to preserve. As they said, they didn't want the records of the monarchy's crimes destroyed. So all those files were carefully preserved. They moved them. Paris has changed a lot then. That neighborhood has been redone. Where you think the Bastille is now was not it. It was the place where the prison actually existed has a little bitty plaque. It's a tiny, maybe a plant or two. Across the street from that was a building, and they moved all those files there. Today, that is a library that houses all these archives. So if the arrest records are there, they've been misfiled and miscatalogued several times. But if you turn every page in all those dossiers, you can find many prison files. However, churches, they of course closed, and they preserved all the sacramental records as well. They housed those near the Louvre in a palace called the Tuileries. If you know Paris, you know those big gardens, the Tuileries gardens in front of the Louvre. The palace was there until 1871. another revolution, the Paris Commune. They burned down the Tuileries. Every church record from Paris was destroyed. So there are no church records. So anytime, give you one example, Geneviève Bettman, I know she has at least one descendant in the audience tonight. I know the date of her birth only because the great aunt, who left her money, specified her age at the time she drew up her will. So it's that kind of thing. You only have birth records, birth dates, etc., if they're mentioned in another kind of archive. Paris has wonderful police archives. It also has incredible notarial archives. That's how I was able to trace families financially. They're not easy to work with. You have to go through, you have to know the notary. If you don't know the person's notary, I promise, one day I went to the head of the archive and I said, I know they live there. He said, Joan, there are 33 notaries in that neighborhood. To go through it would be the rest of my life. So you can't, but if you get one lead, then you can go back through that notary over time. And I would move from financial record to financial record to reconstruct a family's history. Paris also has surviving the Parliament of Paris, which was responsible for many of the trials and legal proceedings, and has those records. They are such a mess that the man I think of as Daniel Roche, the greatest historian of Paris, once said to me, but nobody ever finds anything in those archives. And the head of the archive once, I wrote asking for help, and he said, oh, madame, you know them better than I do, which is a joke. He's the head of the archive, right? But no, people the only method is you read every page, but they do exist. So there's a lot there. It's just that the easy stuff is not there. And you can't ever hope to learn. A marriage, I learned marriage is only when the family had enough money to pay a notary to draw up a contract to specify who had what sums. And that's the only reason. So it's a complicated business.
That's great. Well, thank you for explaining that. We wanted to make a transition now to the questions that our members of the Genealogical Research Society have submitted in advance. We asked our members to let us know their questions that they had from the book and the women who are part of their research. And we wanted to start off with a question about we received about the women's friendships. And this is something that was a question of, if these women were thrown together and, deported together, did some of them become friends? And I was wondering, what can you tell us about the friendships? And you mentioned in the book that two of the women, Miss Bettman and Miss Mahu, remain lifelong friends. And can you tell us about their friendship, and also any other light that you can shed on that?
Yeah, what I know about that friendship is in the book, but there are several what I would call nexuses of friendships. In other words, women who were clearly close and whose families remain close. And I'll give you one example in detail. I've already mentioned Marie Avril, who lived first in Mobile, but her family went to Bayou Saint-Jean after it was Bayou Saint John, and were there. I traced a couple of generations and didn't go beyond that. And her children were interconnected throughout this world. For example, her daughter Elizabeth was the witness, like the maid of honor, at the marriage of one of Jean Mahu's daughters. So that indicates the two daughters were close. One of Marie Avril's grandsons married a granddaughter of another woman, Marianne Fourchet. So the next generation was close. And that granddaughter was named Marie-Louise in honor of her godmother, who was another deported woman, Marie-Louise Balivet. And the final bit I'll give you to link them all together is that when that woman, Marie-Louise Balivet, died, in her will, she left money to repay all her debts. These women were accused of all these crimes, theft, prostitution, were so honest that in their wills, they repaid everyone for every penny. And for example, she left money to repay Marie Avril because when she was sick, Marie Avril had lent her money to buy cheese. Can you imagine these French women? She's dying in Mobile, what becomes Alabama, and she's still eating cheese like a good French woman, and she's borrowed the money. So in other words, these four women are interconnected, and their families remain interconnected for generations. And there's several other kind of interconnected families like that. And the last thing I want to mention, though, is the fact that so many descendants today, descendants of one woman, are very often married to descendants of another woman. And those indicate to me that over 3 centuries, these families have remained interconnected. So sort of 3-century-long friendships. And that seems pretty remarkable.
Mhm. And what more can you tell us about Miss Betmont and Miss Mahou? These are two of the women who have the greatest number of descendants, and as you mentioned before, including a couple of GRSNO members who are here tonight.
Okay, there. I want to tell one story about each of them. For Geneviève Betmont, I was asked by several members, is there any hope of learning anything else? Well, there's one key piece of information that eluded me and I want to describe, and I hope that one day it might be found. So for her family, I was proceeding through the notaries, one document back or forward to another, putting a picture of the family and the family resources together. Well, I get to this key document as notarial archives, and I request it, and it comes back to me that it's lost. So I knew the head of that archive well. He was a very serious scholar and a nice guy. And so I said, what's wrong? Where is it? And he investigated. At some point decades ago, I believe in the 1970s, a Betmont descendant requested a copy of it. The person in the archives removed the document to copy it, and they forgot to put it back. Or they put it back in the wrong place. People do that all the time. And so he put out a big, there's no way they'll find it. Hundreds of thousands. You can't look for a document like this. And so I have asked everyone, please, if anyone comes forward with this document misfiled in another box, let me know. Because if we ever find it, there will be key information there. But that's the kind of thing, dependent on the whims of fate to find something about her. For Jeanne Mahou, I thought I would give you one example. Jeanne Mahou was someone who worked in Paris as a dressmaker's as an apprentice dressmaker. She had been brought to Paris by her sister and her brother-in-law, an apprentice to a dressmaker. Apprenticeships took place all the time. Jeanne Mahou complained about the conditions in the workshop where she was working. And once she did this, her sister and brother-in-law went nuts. It was though the world had fallen down, and they condemned her as a libertine, etc., and turned her into the police because of this. I thought I would tell you a little more about this because that I didn't have room for in the book. Young men complained all the time about apprenticeships. Some of these, you were paid, the master artisan was paid a fee every year. In exchange, he was to feed, clothe, house, even do the laundry for the apprentice. Lots of people didn't really do it. So some apprentices were harshly treated, had too long hours, didn't get enough food, and they complained. This happened for men all the time, but a woman complains and boom, they're down on her. I also wanted to tell one story about how dangerous it was in 1719 to work as a dressmaker. This is a police file that I found from the summer of 1719. Apprentice dressmakers each worked on one piece of a garment. You've seen the great aristocratic garments that women wore in the early 18th century. They were made of many pieces of fabric, and they were embroidered separately and then brought to the head workshop to be put together. I can promise you, because I was allowed to lift some of them, they are heavy. Embroidery in silver and gold thread, they weighed a lot. So each apprentice would be working on one piece. And one evening, at the end of the day's work, 3 apprentice dressmakers were crossing the Palais Royal gardens. You've probably seen those in Paris too, the gardens in the middle of Paris. They were crossing the gardens to go to the workshop of the head dressmaker with their individual pieces so she could put them together. They don't look suspicious, right? They're together. Each of them is carrying a piece of a garment. The police arrest them and they declare them prostitutes and they throw them into prison. These women were lucky. They were married. When they didn't come home, their husbands raised hell and they found them. And because they still had the embroidered garments with them, the police released them. But if women were unmarried at that point and doing something like this, and no one would go to the police to raise hell, they remained in prison. So dressmaking was a dangerous profession in 1719.
We also have a question about the possible connections among women who, these were not the only women who made the journey to the colony. There's a question about connections among women from the Pelican, La Baleine, or the Casket Girls, and the deported women. Do you know if to what extent they were aware of each other when they were in prison or in France?
Okay. The Pelican is so early that it's really outside of what I did. So I don't even have a list of those women. Unfortunately, Randall Ladnier, who wrote a book on the baleine, the whale, and the women who came, those women are known as the casket girls because they traveled. They were asked allegedly, there's always rumor and then fact in these things, if they wanted to go and they were given a casket containing a dowry to start their life in the colony. Anyway, the man who wrote a book on them didn't ask me to look for them until very late in the process. So I'm sure I didn't find all of them. I found one woman from the Baleine who was imprisoned in the Salpêtrière along with the other women. Her name was on the list of women. She was declared a prostitute just like the others. On pages 208 and 209 of the book, I go through her case, Catherine Blanchard, and so she was identical to the women who were deported on the Mutinous Woman. I don't know why she got lucky and didn't make it. It was mayhem in there. And so she became a casket girl. When they were in the colony, I know of the kinds of friendship networks I was describing. I don't know of any between deported women and casket girls, but I wasn't looking for them. I was looking for a lot of women, so I didn't track absolutely everyone all the time. So I don't know, but it's hard for me to answer that question. I do know the person also asked if the casket girls considered themselves superior to the deported women. I can only report something I quote in the book, that is a historian, Dumont, the first great historian of French Louisiana, said something like, the casket girls were reported to be more distinguished than the deported women. And he, Dumont, married one of the deported women, Marie Baron. So this probably reflects her opinion that they consider themselves above the deported women. But there's no more fact than that.
Okay, thank you. We have another question about Etienne Genet, who may have been confused in some research as a passenger on La Baleine.
Yeah.
What can you tell us about her, and then also more broadly, kind of the extent of the mistakes that you uncovered in the research, in the documents?
Okay. Etienne Genet was a woman who traveled on the Two Brothers, the Deux Frères. I have no idea where all the mistakes surrounding her originated. I can tell you what I know. There's so many mistakes that when I began working on her, I almost gave up. I was really to eliminate her name to avoid all of this. I'll tell you some of it. She was not arrested in Paris. She was from Sens in Burgundy, Sens. And Sens was a strange place. There were a huge number of deported men and women at that time who came from Sens. So someone there was arresting, but then no records left there. So I couldn't check. So I had to rely on the records in the Parisian prison, and the head of the prison for women in Paris, the Salpêtrière, a woman named Marguerite Poncatelin, was totally untrustworthy. She would say anything about anyone. And I'm going to give you some of the difficulties in trying to understand who Etienne Genet was. The mistakes came from the fact that her first name was sometimes written Toinette, which is a diminutive for Antoinette, and sometimes Tiennette, which is a diminutive for Etiennette, which was in fact her name. When she married in New Orleans, she gave that name. For her last name, I found all these variants in the Parisian records. Jeanette, two T's, Jeunesse, E-T, Genese, E-S-E, and Genet, G-E-N-E, which was in fact the name she used. So there's all of this, and sometimes people went through this. The person who reported this believed the head of the Parisian women's prison and asked me if I thought that Etienne Genet was mentally disturbed. And I said, you can't believe that warden. She would put down anything. She was just rambling and writing things down. And for example, for one of the women whose life I can trace most carefully in France, Manon Fontaine, it's true, Manon Fontaine was accused of murder once. However, the police exonerated her. There wasn't a shred of evidence. When it came to deporting, time for deportation, the same head of the women's prison declared that she was guilty of having murdered 15 men. So one accusation becomes 15 convictions. So you don't trust a woman like that. So I can't believe, in other words, I really don't have much idea of who Etienne, I can't even tell you Etienne Genet's age because the same woman gave two different ages. So my whole file on her is like question mark, because there was no outside source in which I could evaluate things.
Let's see. Okay. Another question from a GRSNO member is they remarked on how branding was used on these women, and there's a number of questions related to that. How often did it occur? What did it mean to be branded? Can you tell us what you learned about that?
Branding was a form of punishment used, I won't say often, but it was not uncommon during the monarchy, both men and women. You were branded on a shoulder. Usually it was the fleur-de-lis, the symbol of the French monarchy, to indicate a crime against the French monarchy. Sometimes he did an initial, like V for vol, theft, but usually it was the fleur-de-lis. And I can tell you about one case, since I just mentioned it, the woman Manon Fontaine, who was convicted of nothing, right? She was also once accused of theft. The man who was the thief and who admitted the crime said he had never seen her before. So she had nothing to do with that crime. When she got mad because they imprisoned her, and she contested everything, and they hated the police who fought back against this. And so then they sentenced her to be stripped naked, branded, and to watch his hang, walk through the streets naked while being branded, and watch the execution. So branding was a sort of random punishment. Numbers of the women who were deported had been branded on one shoulder and sometimes on two. So I got to thinking of it as something that people were used to. It was like a badge of honor, because so many of them had gone through this and they had survived and were living better lives in New Orleans or other places in the colony.
Thank you. We received another question, kind of a more general question about your, do you have a favorite woman among all the women that you studied? Or is there another story that has always fascinated you that you'd like to share?
I read that question. I thought, really? You think with this crowd, I would name a favorite woman? I will have the descendants of other women against me. No, but seriously, if there's one woman who became a sort of favorite, it was Manon Fontaine, because she had no descendants. By the time she was deported, she was too old to have children. And God knows what she had been through in prison in addition. And so she has no descendants to speak up for her. So I always felt that I had to speak up for Manon Fontaine. In addition, I know more about her life in Paris than about any of the other lives. So she became like the person I knew best in the story. But I have affection for many of them, because they were remarkable women and quite endearing in different ways.
And one other question, which you and I talked about a little bit, it may be outside of your field of study, but one of our members asked about Marie Fouché, and whether you have any information related to her.
Yeah, this was about her time in New Orleans, and I quote in the document and this time, Marianne Fouché spent most of her life in Mobile, and with her first husband, Jean Lacaze, she was briefly in New Orleans in 1725, and I quote the document, and that's all the information I have. There was another question about that family, but in the Spanish in New Orleans under Spanish rule, and that's just too late. I didn't trace most families into the Spanish colonial document. I had to stop somewhere.
Sure. Well, we definitely appreciate all of your time going through the questions from the members. It's been very interesting to kind of get those insights about the individuals that they discussed. And we wanted to ask, as we sort of wrap up for tonight, there's sort of you and I talked a little bit before the program about other information that did not make it into your book that you wanted to discuss, and you had sort of these interesting questions about guilt and innocence, and there was a case that you were very much fascinated with and wanted to thought it might be good for our members to hear that, and to understand what you know about that
Okay,
individual.
thanks. This is a case of a woman whom I found because I didn't stop doing the police archives in 1719 when they were deported. I was curious to see if the kinds of behavior I had noticed continued. So I went on until 1722. 1719, they were deported. 1720, as I said, is a financial meltdown. 1721, John Law flees France in disgrace at the end of 1720. 1721, France is still totally up in the air. By 1722, things were calming down, and I did note real differences in the types of crimes, in the ways crime was treated. And I thought I'd cite the example of one woman who could have been deported, but for. Her name is Suzanne Michaud, and she was arrested in 1717. They didn't tell her why she was arrested. They banished her from Paris. And she went to the police and said, but why am I being banished? She was working in Paris as a laundress. That was the profession shared by the greatest number of deported women. It was one thing poor women could do in Paris. You worked in households, you collected the laundry, you washed it, you brought it back, etc. The police would not tell her why she was banished, but she was lucky. She had a family in the province. She lived in a tiny village in northern France. Her family was still alive. Many of the women no longer had parents, or and in the provinces, or no longer had parents who could afford to take them in. So they couldn't leave Paris. Some of them had no relatives in the provinces. Manon Fontaine was banished, but she had no family to go to. This young woman had a family. Her father was still alive. He was happy to take her in. She left, and she remained in her village until 1722, when the world was different. She came back to Paris in 1722. They arrested her again, but the priest in her neighborhood and her neighbors all got irate at this, and they went to the police as character witnesses, and they said she's good. What they learned that she had been banished in 1717 based on anonymous accusations. And in 1719, a number of the women who were deported because of anonymous accusations. By 1722, that didn't work anymore. People defended her. She was released. And so the file ends with a woman having gone through, yes, a horrible story, but she's been released. So if these women had been able to get out of Paris in 1719, they probably would not have come to the colony either. We can ask whether Louisiana was better off because of them or not, but that's what I want to point. The danger was there. And I wanted to sort of end by saying something that is important to me. I'm not a descendant of any of the deported women. However, as I was working on this, those of you who've read the book know that I say this in the coda to the book. I discovered that on my mother's side of the family, the first European to come over to the colony, he was living near what is now near Mobile. I keep saying what is now Alabama. It was already Mobile. And he was a witness at the weddings of several of the children of deported women. And I felt when you're a witness at a wedding, you're saying in the Catholic Church, I know who that person is. I know them, and I'm attesting that they are what they say they are and who they say they are. And I felt that that was my role in this story, that these women had been misrepresented in the records in France. And I saw myself as a witness saying, I know who they are. I know what I can tell you about them. I know that they were not the women the police portrayed them to be. And I felt in the long run that the lives they led in the colony, and these women were blameless. They didn't become prostitutes in New Orleans. They didn't steal, they didn't do commit any crimes. And those blameless lives, the quality of those lives speak for them, that they are the lives they lived in the colony. They are also the descendants they leave today. And we could ask, but I know that several people in the audience there are descendants, and you should be proud of your ancestors and not consider them what the police consider them to be.
And I think that's a terrific message from your book, is, that you dug into the lives of what really happened to the women and tried to tell their stories. And it's a very valuable resource for our members, and also just people who, future generations of researchers who want to know about their stories and it's not forgotten to history. So we definitely appreciate that, and thank you for doing that research and writing the book. Um, we're about out of time for our event tonight, our discussion with Dr. DeJean. Is there anything else you'd like to add?
No, I just hope, I'm glad to see some of you, a couple of you whom I've corresponded with you, and get a sense of faces. And I hope that we haven't had time for more questions, but I hope I've dealt with some of the questions, the most pressing questions that people sent in, and thank you for sending the questions.
Okay. And thanks to everyone who's joined us tonight. We'll have a video of this posted online, and I'll circulate that to the members of the Genealogical Research Society. And we'll also keep it posted on our Facebook page. And we certainly welcome everybody who wants to learn more about genealogical research, and hope you can join us at our next event. Thank you, everyone, for joining tonight.
Bye. Thanks, guys. Bye. Thank you, Stephen.
You're welcome. You're welcome, Joan. Thank you.